Good afternoon. Thanks for coming back from lunch. I know that one of the challenges this panel is being the one right after lunch is, we have to be a pretty good draw to get people in from outside into here and also keep people awake before they get the food coma, especially when you're able to get that second sandwich that you were craving earlier. Austin really queued up the panel really well, and I want to thank him, and I actually want to thank all the organizers of the conference. I've been going to this for several years, and you do a great job every year with this discussion. The issue here of policy is that policy can often be seen as an impediment, an obstacle to overcome in this. It can potentially also be an enabler, offering new opportunities, providing assurances to companies and their investors, that they're able to do what they want to do in space. And so what we want to talk about here in this panel is sort of a broad range of policy topics that are at front of mind right now for people in the industry. What are some of the issues? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the opportunities in the policy realm as it supports commercial space activities? So we've got a great panel here. We've got Dave Radzanowski, who's chair of the board of the ISS National Lab, Alex Coultrup, who is the director of business and policy at Starfish Space, and Matt Linton, the chief legal officer and general counsel at True Anomaly. So rather than me read their bios, the same bios that you can read in the program, I've asked them to spend a minute or two to sort of introduce themselves and also touch upon what are sort of the key policy issues they have in mind right now, some of the issues they may be dealing with or may find of particular interest to them and to their companies. So Dave, why don't we start with you?
Great. Hope you all had a great lunch. I sure did, and I'm ready for a nap. Dave Radzanowski, I'm chair of the board of Space Station National Lab, but really I'm just a recovering government bureaucrat. I have about 35 years of experience as a bureaucrat, mostly in the federal government, included roles on Congress, White House budget office during Clinton and Bush, and then at NASA, where culminated as the chief financial officer at NASA during the Obama administration. And love the panels up to date. A lot of them are related to where my interests stand. But before I get into that, I had some questions of the students here. How do you get ready to work in this environment and that? And I'm going to be the first one that's going to say, politics is good. And as we talk about business and finance, and government, in many ways, has been leading the development of the space environment. As it evolves to go more commercial and more private, government is still key to all of this. And if you don't understand how government works, how Congress, the White House, other nations get involved in this, then go into the space industry at your peril. Right now, government does drive a lot of this, and we're going to talk about data sovereignty and regulations. Regulations can kill markets. Regulations can entice markets. And the one example I'm interested in right now is the space station. So as the National Lab, we're more focused on the non-NASA work that is done on space station. Other government agencies, private sector, academia. And our role is to actually help evolve and facilitate future commercial activities in space and in low Earth orbit. And we're coming up to the end of space station. And you've heard from others, there's a panel on the CLDs. So that's happening next. And guess what? Government's in the middle of it. And the government's usually not very good at keeping itself out of ditches. We're very good at getting ourselves out, keeping ourselves from going into ditches. We're very good at getting out of ditches. So as we're transitioning from space station to these commercial LEO destinations, that's 5 years away. There's not enough money to do them in parallel necessarily. We have to deorbit space station, the vehicle is $1 billion, and no one's giving us extra money to deorbit. So we have to take it away from those companies that might actually support the future CLDs. The second thing is you met some of the CLDs folks, and there's more out there, is they need private investment. And they have a lot of investors who are unwilling to invest in them at this point in time until they know they're going to bet on a winner. And NASA hasn't decided what it's doing on phase 2, and NASA hasn't decided who's going to be the winners through a competitive process. And so the poor companies that are going to want to work on station and then shift to the CLDs, how do I pick on a winner? It's hard to get private investment in something and when the government hasn't set its policy yet. So I'll stop at that, but in all that we've discussing today, do not forget to get understanding of policy and how government works and how politics works. And that's how you'll be especially successful in the space industry, whether you work for government or whether you work in the private sector.
Alex?
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff, for moderating. Thank you all for having us here. My name is Alex Coultrup. I am, as Jeff said, Director of Business and Policy at Starfish Space, which is an in-space satellite servicing company. So about 5 years old, a small startup, and the idea is we build a satellite called the Otter, and Otter's job is to go pick up other satellites already in space, grab them, move them somewhere else, drop them off, and rinse and repeat. So it's like a taxi service in space. As far as policy issues that are on my mind right now, the industry segment that Starfish exists in is called ISAM. You may be familiar with this acronym, In-Space Servicing, Assembly, and Manufacturing. ISAM technologies are novel capabilities. These are things that the commercial industry, I guess, and government is only doing now for the first time, by and large. What that means is there's very little regulation around our activity. On one hand, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that gives us the freedom to iterate and develop best practices kind of outside of any coercive force from government. But on the other hand, maybe that's a bad thing. I think as these two guys said, regulatory certainty is what gives investors peace of mind to support you. And as a venture-backed startup, that's pretty important to us as well. So we are currently, and I say we, the US government hand in hand with commercial is in the process today of deciding who our regulator is going to be and what the regulations that might be imposed on us would look like. It's important that that so-called authorization and supervision exists within the US for our capabilities, or else we are out of compliance with Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. Other examples of how auth and SOUP works around the industry, the FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation, regulates launch, right? FCC regulates RF comms, and Earth imaging is regulated by NOAA. So who's going to regulate us is the question. And I think we have our perspective in industry of who we would like that to be. Maybe I'll save it for the discussion. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you. Great to be here, everyone. Thank you to everyone that has put this program on, to Eve Ruff from True Anomaly, who got me involved here. There's something I think very fascinating and profound about space, as we all know, but sometimes I think it's worth kind of rewinding for a moment and thinking, you know, like, what are these foundational principles in the law that we really want to bring forward into this next stage of humanity? Are we going to do it the same way we've always done before, or are we going to think of new solutions, particularly from the governance and policy perspective? And as a lawyer, you know, I can't help but comment on, here we are, we're in Boston. I never get to go to this part of the country that often. I'm off in the hinterland of Colorado. And, you know, you look here and you're like, the foundations of this nation, which ultimately, you know, form so much of the foundations of the way in which we view sort of the Western free world, you know, started here. And these concepts, these basic concepts of the way in which humans should govern themselves started here. And, you know, some of the principles that, you know, we established as a nation continue to succeed. Some of them don't, and we figured this out. But what I think we should be always challenging ourselves with is, how do we want to do it better or differently on orbit, on the moon, on other celestial bodies? And these are things that, as a company, we're a national security focused company, and we are focused on enabling US space superiority as the Space Force defines it, and allied space superiority. That means we are looking to secure the space domain writ large for freedom to maneuver, freedom to innovate, freedom to engage in science, freedom to do things that we probably can't even think of at this time. How do we, kind of take this morass of regulatory structures and the Outer Space Treaty and all these things and actually do something useful that enables business? I think these are some of the key questions. And I would say, actually, I'll put a question out. How many people in the room have recently listened to the classic JFK moon speech? Probably this room is going to have a few more than most rooms. I would submit to you, watch it again, it's not that long. The issues that JFK put forward in his classic speech are effectively no different today than they were, I think, was that 1961? I'm not sure. The same principles that he talks about are the issues that face us right now. And in fact, some of this stuff, is finally coming to a head in terms of how we view the inter-engagement of, sort of great powers of this planet, and how can we engage with each other in a way that does not lead to war. And when we look at our basic policies when it comes to, for example, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, and which effectively says that when you launch something from your nation, every nation has to take responsibility for the stuff they put into space. Well, that actually becomes quite inherently problematic and is very different than just about any other industry. Imagine for a moment that if your average Silicon Valley app, ultimately whatever it did is the responsibility of the United States people, of the government of the United States. And if they do something that could be viewed as aggressive or a potential act of war, suddenly just one little company with one little satellite could be essentially found under this framework that we currently have as having engaged on behalf of the nation in a potential act of war. This is a framework that I would submit is no longer feasible in a world where we have this proliferation of new private space companies that needs to innovate. And the last thing I'll say on this particular topic is, if you look at the history of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty and this authorization and supervision provision, it was negotiated by the Soviet Union to block American private industry from developing their space capabilities. And we still live with this provision of the Outer Space Treaty.
That's true.
All right. So we got a lot to go with there. Maybe we'll start with that particular thread there. And what Matt was talking about is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Article 6 says that countries have the responsibility for the authorization and continuing supervision of the activities of non-state actors under them. So you have a regulatory system that has, in the U.S. at least, grown up sort of organically. FCC is responsible for spectrum. We gave FAA responsibility for launch licensing. NOAA got remote sensing for probably good reasons at the time. But, Alex, as you mentioned, there are a lot of novel space activities where it's not clear who in the U.S. government has that responsibility and who has the ability to say, yes, you can do something, or potentially say, no, you can't do something. So let's start with there. How do you resolve this, what's often called mission authorization? So if we use that term, now you know what we're talking about here. How to resolve that mission authorization issue? Who should have that responsibility? Should any government agency have that responsibility?
Well, I think that Matt brought up a very good point about the history of Article 6 and why it now is so complicated and thorny for us in the modern era. Is there an argument that significant portions of the OST are no longer relevant? Sure. Is it in our best interest to flaunt an international treaty? Maybe not, which is not what I'm saying that you're saying, Matt. I think consensus among the ISAM industry, at least, is that the 3 existing authorizing bodies, none of them are appropriately equipped to supervise our activities A lot of ISAM deals with moving objects through space, not launching through the atmosphere. So FAA is out, right? We're doing space-to-space imaging to look at our clients. That's not Earth imaging. NOAA is out because they don't have expertise in that. And then finally, yes, you need to communicate with your satellite via RF spectrum, but really the license you receive for that is separate from the operations that I would argue we want to perform with Starfish that are the core service we sell. So I don't believe that the FCC should be the one to hold our regulations. I personally think that, not personally, most folks in the ISAM industry are aligned that the Office of Space Commerce, which today is housed under NOAA, is the most equipped to be our regulator for the reason that they have real hands-on experience in space situational awareness and space traffic coordination through the TRACS initiative, which is essentially making space traffic data available to the public around the world as a public good rather than a paywalled service. You could go to companies for more exquisite and bespoke versions of commercial space traffic data. But I think that if we are bringing to bear more mobility in space than the world has ever seen, and so-called dynamic space operations, or whatever the newest DoD buzzword is from the days of maneuver without regret to sustained space maneuver to dynamic space operations, it makes sense to me that being supervised by an office who has experience in all of the other traffic information that's going on in space could be the right way to go.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, can I just add, I mean, I'll throw a really different perspective on this. And Matt got me going on this in terms of the origination of the treaty. There are times in evolution of society and culture and business when it makes sense to rethink, are these the right treaties anymore? Mm-hmm. They were maybe right for that point in time. Maybe it isn't today. Or the government organizations that have grown up organically. If I'm a business right now, I don't want to deal with the government, right? And I have to go to all these different places. NASA is a big civilian space agency. Is like, we don't do regulations. So from a policy standpoint, there are times and places when the government maybe should sit back and think about, are we organized correctly? Do we have the mechanisms to promote the private sector, or do we need to think about changing those? And I'm not here to say I'm a proponent of doing any of that, but I truly believe we are at a point, I heard somebody say a tipping point earlier today, we are at the point where we really do need to look at our government structures. Spaces and the business of that community and the national security issues in that have outgrown our policies, outgrown potentially our treaties, and outgrown our bureaucracy. And for us to move forward, we probably need to rethink them. By the way, I'm not affiliated with anybody.
Dave, I think you're onto something here. I will say that it is so much easier to critique an existing system, even when we know our critiques are valid, than to construct a new one. What would be your alternate proposal?
A bit of it, and stay with me here. There's something to be said about allowing a Wild Wild West and having the industry police itself. Not that I'm just throwing ideas. I get to be like a student today, right? Government, I'm a bureaucrat. I actually don't understand how the private sector works. I don't understand how money and venture capital works. I don't understand how you build a business case and that. And yet I'm making the decisions of that's going to govern how you operate. So I actually think my solution is to have more of the industry drive. Somebody said capitalism earlier. It's been successful so far, and perhaps we need to step back, let the industry do its self-policing. They're not going to, well, some of them might do stupid. I volunteer to be the reverse space pirate, by the way. That they'll police themselves in their best interest to be successful. They aren't going to do things that are going to destroy their business. And trust that. And It's a huge world out there that's competing with us. It used to be the US and maybe the Soviet Union, Russia. Now it's the US and everybody else. And I'm not sure the US is going to win a lot of that competition going forward until we start thinking very differently of our organization. So I don't have an answer. Otherwise, we need to have debate, and I do think we need to allow private industry to govern themselves a bit more than they are now.
Matt?
I'll take the bait a little bit and jump in, because I probably not surprisingly would generally agree here. And I think there's a couple of things also to mention. Like, I've said this various ways over the last year or so, and to anyone who would listen, but that, the idea, this very basic idea of opening a sandbox on orbit for private corporations to engage in tests that are not so constrained by issues of spectrum. One of the issues we get with any sort of space launch is with FCC and spectrum interference, and I get it, there's a big issue in terms of limited spectrum, but it makes it very hard to experiment, and it makes it very hard for Americans or any nation to do what I think we've done great in the US, which is enable technological experimentation at its base level and its most market-based version of it, and that's what we're good at. We're good at letting people like students of this university and others come up with things that nobody can think of before and just go try and do them. It's really hard to do that in space because of this just massive overarching control, state control that we have over it. And so to the extent that we can figure out, is there a allocation of spectrum that we can use for more experimentation? Is there a place on orbit that we can allow people to launch into and, frankly, screw up? Are there companies that we could deploy to pick up the mess? There are companies that are doing that, right? We got orbital debris problems. Maybe we be thoughtful, okay, if we're going to enable sandbox environment, we also have to figure out how to clean up the sandbox. We don't have any of these structures right now. It's kind of just all open. But I also think there's something important, which is I do think we're going to enter this era of more private experimentation, less state control, and it's increasingly important on companies like ours, like yours, to take this deep responsibility that we actually do have to set what we think are reasonable norms of behavior that are ultimately going to be what not only facilitate sort of this industrial revolution that we are seeing of the space arena, but to do it in a way that makes sense for those businesses, but also is not some sort of deeply unethical, profoundly wrong way of acting. But we're getting better at this, right? Like Sloan, I'm sure, has classes on business ethics, right? Most business schools do. America does great things when we let private industry use the maximum capabilities that it has and relies on its great university system to train the next generation to enter. Nobody wants to hear, though, from the lawyers that tell them what they can't do. We've got to get that messaging away from this arena.
I might argue that the right balance for a framework going forward is if there is going to be some regulatory oversight from government, because we're building something new and we have the opportunity to set up a new framework in a way that the space industry hasn't really had in a while, it has to be done with like such an intensely intimate relationship with industry, right? Like a deep and detailed amount of feedback and back and forth. If there must be regulations, or if there must be oversight of some kind, can we write our own rules? Because we, as the operators, we know better than anyone what this technology is capable of, how it can be wielded, and what the different use cases are. So I think I've been very grateful to see a lot of folks in government are more open these days to input from industry on stuff like this. Maybe that's the right balance for the tight spot we find ourselves in right now.
Right. I want to bring up sort of a related issue in terms of the interplay between companies and the government. And this ties into one of the hot takes that we had from one of the panels earlier on, and that is the use of services contracts by government agencies to procure commercial services rather than buying spacecraft or launch vehicles or so on. And we have seen that grown quite a bit in the last several years. NASA is heavily relying on commercial services now for supporting the space station and for Artemis. We are seeing on the national security side, purchases of commercial imagery and commercial communications and so on. The suggestion that Erica mentioned in her hot take this morning was that maybe the government's gone too far and is relying too much on government services, on services contracts for things that maybe really shouldn't be procured as services. So curious, your thoughts, has the pendulum swung too much in one direction on that?
No.
I'm also a no.
No.
Should I say yes then? No.
No.
Now, the way I look at it is it's government is in its own experimentation now of how it works with this nascent and growing industry. And I mean, there's definitely some things that we shouldn't do fixed price on. Like, we should not do fixed price on Webb Space Telescope. It would never get built. There are some things, however, that perhaps we are willing to take the risk, share the risk between the government and the private sector, because industry is much more along in its capability, and they're not really creating something all that new. We might be integrating it a little bit differently, but it's not developing a new technology. So that makes sense. So I think we're in an experimental phase on that, and I recently had an interaction with some of the NASA cost folks that have been looking historically now that we've had CRS, we've had the commercial crew services, we've got CLIPS, lunars, and they're starting to look at what have we learned from this, what are we showing? And the early data is showing in those, it's actually taking us as long from start to finish, but it's costing us a lot less. So that to me is a success. Even more so of a success for the taxpayer. And so my answer was no, is just because I think we're still experimenting. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're going to go too far, and sometimes it really shouldn't be the government that's doing it. But we need to keep experimenting right now.
Are there things the government can do to perhaps improve the process or provide protections? Matt, I'm thinking particularly of True Anomaly. You're working the national security side. You're doing things that typically that governments have done. Should governments be providing you with indemnification or protection if you're doing national security work and an adversary attacks?
Yes. And I say, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but yes, this is a really serious issue though. And for just more context, right? So we're venture-backed. We build our private satellite for the purpose of national security. Let's say that satellite is attacked, taken out of commission. As of right now, you have a really hard time convincing that acquisition official, even whether they're buying it for a service or some sort of GoCo type arrangement, very hard, if not impossible, to get any sort of indemnity from the government. It's also effectively impossible to get insurance, because what does insurance always exclude? Acts of war. There's a couple of war policies out there. Apparently there's some guy in the Cayman Islands that's working on something. I mean, that's the arena that we're in here. I mean, it's ridiculous, but you can't really get protection from the government other than maybe a wink or a nod, like, well, if that ever happens, we'll talk about it. Well, that's not really helpful to investors that are putting hundreds of millions of dollars into a company. So I think we need to make more progress here. I think DoD and the U.S. government needs to be just explicit about, yes, we will cover acts of war against your platform if it's being used by us.
Before I go to audience for questions, I'd be remiss, since it's part of the title, talking about data sovereignty. If you are seeing any particular issues in your companies or your industries regarding data rights, any concerns about control of data, access to ground stations, anything along those lines that people should be aware of.
This is not the answer to exactly the question you asked, Jeff, but it's what I have. I think I'll just say for Starfish, we do a good job taking care of our data. I'm not super concerned on that front. What I think is on my mind is what in-space close rendezvous proximity operations and inspection capabilities, and even docking, which is what we're trying to do at Starfish, what are the implications there for data sovereignty? An example would be, historically, we have had confidence that, oh, my satellite is in space, it's far away from Earth. An adversary can't really look at it just because it's so far away and it's so small and it's really hard to resolve details. We know that other nations are developing the same capabilities that our companies are developing. What does it mean for data sovereignty for design methods or the physical configuration or the way payloads look on the external geometry of national security satellites? If adversary nations can now just fly up and image them very closely in a way that in the past was physically impossible. I think that's really going to change the way we think about how national security or even commercial satellites are designed, especially as more and more companies provide their commercial services to the government. So that's an open question right now for what trends that might drive in the industry, whether it be design trends or trying to push different norms of behavior for how far away we stay from people's satellites without their consent. And as you were alluding to, what does and does not constitute an act of aggression? Where along the spectrum of conflict from this is annoying to this is war, would a close inspection like that fall, maybe depending on the asset itself?
And the one thing that, you know, in the decades that I've looked at data policy and that, if the government is spending taxpayer monies to get the data, then private sector, it's a public good. And that the taxpayer should not having to pay for it again. And that runs counter to doing a business, right? If you're doing these services and saying, oh, it's like, well, the government's buying the data for a public good, then it's competing with your providing the data to somebody else. And so that balance, so there'll always be that tension between this is the taxpayer's money, therefore it's a public good, and versus data sovereignty is really important for the business to be successful often. So it's an interesting tension.
I'll just jump in with a thought on the ground station side. You know, how do you trace the data you generate from your satellite, or if you're on the moon, send it down to a worldwide network of ground stations from a basic legal perspective, whose laws apply to that data when it gets downlinked to the ground station? And are we going to see nations try to edge their way into being able to access this, you know, whether it's national security related, which you got to provide all sorts of different kinds of encryption, or more just, you know, ordinary commercial level data, which is incredibly valuable to various companies. I actually think the market might govern this a bit here, because if nations start trying to grab the data where ground stations are located, those ground stations are going to just pull out of there. And if there's any sort of dual use overlap with the national security side, and we've seen this actually with a couple of nations already, you're just not going to be able to use those ground stations, period. So if you want to be in the business of enabling space communications and having ground station setups in a way that actually may be profitable to your nation, you're going to need to basically say that there's a wall around that data, or something that, you know, protects it, and that you're not going to actually apply your nation's laws to the use of that data if it's just simply like transiting through.
All right. I've got a full list of other questions I can ask, but I want to open it up to you in the audience, give you an opportunity to quiz the panel. And so I'm going to defer to the people with the microphones, because those are the people with the real power in the room, is who have the microphones, to find some people with some questions. And in the interest of time, keep those questions short and to the point, and we'll try and do the same with the answers to get as many people an opportunity to ask.
Thank you again so much for the panel. My question regards the Artemis Accords, and broadly, we've discussed how the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 has been woefully outdated. It's very much in this Cold War framework, the realities simply do not reflect the nature of the treaty anymore. And I wanted to get your perception on whether the Artemis Accords are a step in the right direction. Are they in danger of falling into the same place that the Outer Space Treaty is falling into? Or is this something we'd like to see when it comes to enforcing norms in outer space? Thank you.
I see the Artemis Accords as very modern, and I see them as very pro-business, especially with the discussion of what you can do with like minerals or materials that you grab from space or celestial bodies. I also see them as a way for the United States really to shape what norms in modern space activity are. So it might depend on who you talk to, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
And I would just say, I think, again, I take a legal lens through this. If a treaty is, in some sense, one views, if you were to view it as, quote, out of date, is it out of date or is it just our interpretation that's out of date? And I would submit that the Artemis Accords are an evolution of the interpretation that we bring to things like the Outer Space Treaty. And so we should be flexing that muscle more than saying, this doesn't work or that doesn't work. It's well, how do we actually interpret it? And from a legal perspective, we work with laws that are hundreds of years old, including our own Constitution. We're able to interpret it. Some people don't like those interpretations sometimes, but we're able, as a society, to deal with the evolution of interpretations, even of long-standing things like treaties. And so I actually think that, for example, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty doesn't necessarily need to be excised. It just needs to be viewed with the lens of something like even the Artemis Accords.
Matt, would you say that in an ideal world, some of the principles of the Artemis Accords could be either put into a new treaty that everyone would ratify, or even I don't know if you can add addendums or amendments to existing treaties? Obviously not possible in today's global framework, but is that where you're coming from?
Yes, although I think actually for the Artemis Accords, I would say, probably been very successful thus far. We continue to see people, new nations signing up routinely. And so I would say that it doesn't necessarily need to be ratified as a full treaty for it to have the effect that we want. Mm-hmm. If we have the consensus of a huge body of the international community and nations that say, you know what, these are the rules that we think we should play by, do we need the formality? I mean, at the end of the day, if somebody breaks the Outer Space Treaty, who's enforcing it? No different than if somebody breaks the rules of the Artemis Accord. So I think maybe not necessary, and maybe we can just live with these things more in a consensus-based approach.
Worth noting on that respect, there are, I think, 54 countries now have signed the Artemis Accord, so we're about half of the Outer Space Treaty signatories at this point. So that's useful argument for that. Next question.
Hi, yes, I'm Scarlett Kohler. I guess I'm one of the powerful people in the room now with the microphone, but hold on, I have some notes. David, actually, you said earlier that you don't know anything about how a commercial company works, and then in the same breath that they should self-police, which is, the kind of thing that gave us the 37 MAX and doors falling off Boeing. So I am going to take issue with that, and I wonder if you think that is going to be accurate in a world where, as Matt pointed out, there are governments that are going to be taking on some risk and offering indemnity for new space technologies in the interest of their national security. Do you think really that there should be self-policing of the industry in that context?
So I'll add on to it. It's great point. The way I'm looking at it right now is the technologies and the way the business is working is going faster than the government processes can deal with, and how we deal with society. And so I actually, when's the last time we had an appropriations? We keep having continuing resolutions, right? The government doesn't necessarily operate quickly, and the business environment, particularly the space environment, now you've got AI and language learning models and everything, government's not going to be able to keep up with it. And if it tries to, it's just going to neuter it to a certain extent. So it sort of was my point, is the government process that we have today isn't able to keep up with the technology of the way it's happening right now. Eventually, bad things will happen. Like I said, we're really good at getting out of a ditch. And so we're going to go in some ditches. We're going to make some huge mistakes, and then the government will learn like that and say, okay, here's the boundaries now, versus the government setting the boundaries and getting them wrong, and suddenly China's here, or as an American, Europe's here, or India's here. We want to help facilitate the US. Again, I'm a US employee, right? To be successful. And so that's sort of the way I'm thinking. I understand business, truly, but
After something bad happens necessarily. If
when the public says, please reinsert yourself, it'll insert itself.
too many people don't have to die for that.
People will die.
Government's very good at being reactive.
Yes.
Less so in being proactive.
Yes.
As a plug for sort of self-regulation, actually I think about this maybe, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I'd put it out there for you all to think about. As a member of a profession that is self-policing, keep in mind the legal profession regulates itself. Obviously, there's licensing involved, and you have to take the bar. Similar to the medical profession licenses itself. We certainly have, and I put that out there as there are examples where we trust companies, law firms, medical industry, you name it, to operate in a world in which a lot of it is actually self-policed already. And so, are there things that we can bring from those concepts, the old professions and the way they handled it, and apply that a little bit to the corporate context in the government? I don't know, but I don't think this is like necessarily binary. I think we have a lot of precedent for self-policing that actually does work at the end of the day.
I think it comes down to what are you trying to achieve, but like what are you willing to sacrifice in order to maybe get a little more safety or get a little more margin in your operations. There's been a lot of talk today about the economic system that the US operates under. The incentive for profit can really complicate those decisions. And you were talking about business ethics earlier. I appreciate you raising this question, Scarlett, because it is something we have to take seriously, and I don't know that as ISAM operations, speaking for us, are nascent, that we have really figured out what those boundaries are yet. I hope that we do.
All right.
I have another example. I just thought of it. It's not space related, but it's AI related in terms of regulation. I have a good friend who's an AI expert on that and a government person. When Europe came up with its AI regulations, European Union, I read them and I was like, yes, this is awesome. My friend who understands business sort of said, Europe just took themselves out of the AI market. Maybe that's fine for that cultures and that, but it's interesting in the dynamic between how government and business relate to each other and what's important for your nation, whether it's business, which is how the U.S. is really focused, or is it not to say we don't care about people, we do, obviously, but we're willing to take greater risks than maybe some other cultures.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for a great discussion and a great panel. I believe there's been an awful lot of discussion on regulation that the government can provide and that very important framework. I'm also curious to hear if you have any thoughts on are there public goods and infrastructure that the industry would hope the government steps up and funds perhaps with taxpayer dollars that the private sector just aren't able to provide. I know orbital debris was brought up at one point, sort of thinking along those lines. Is there infrastructure for space that the public sector should look to provide to grow the industry?
I love this question. And I think I kind of mentioned it in passing earlier, the TRACS system, the Office of Space Commerce has set up. Everybody needs space situational awareness data. Historically, gathered and distributed by kind of an antiquated system in the DoD, moved from the Air Force to the Space Force, the 18th Delta does that. And then in Trump 1, he came along with Space Policy Directive 3 and said, let's take all of this data that's like outdated and not updated at the cadence that we really need for modern operations. Office of Space Commerce set up TRACS, a system where we can track it and make space traffic information free to the public as a public good. But how are we acquiring this new, more modern, more precise look at space traffic information? By purchasing it as a data buy from commercial companies, which now exist and can capture that data at different levels of fidelity, essentially like from different angles, right? The question becomes like the competition between the profit incentive and the public good. How much is enough to be a threshold for safety and open access, where traffic information can be available to the public, versus, you know, what can we leave for higher tiers of like subscription-based models for these commercial companies to make money? I think that's all very complicated now, as now in Trump 2, his administration has come out and done a 180 on Space Policy Directive 3, and essentially saying Office of Space Commerce no longer do tracks, and let's put it all either in the hands of a nonprofit or private organizations. So I think that is where we stand today. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts on other public goods that might exist in space.
Well, I mean, reality launch continues to be a serious impediment. I mean, there's a handful of companies that can pull it off. I don't know the answer to this, but like, you know, if I mean, our own national security needs aren't being met by the current launch capabilities of the nation, let alone the commercial needs. Our company, we're on wait lists years long for launches going out into the, you know, near 2030s at this point. I don't know what it's gonna take. Is it a Manhattan level project to come up with some new propulsion, some new means by which that we can loft to orbit? But the same old rocket engines with some tweaks here or there, they're too expensive, they fail too often. We've got to find a way to get to space in a less costly way. Many people will say this. I do think, though, the amount of money and scientific effort it might take probably continue to implicate a national, if not international, approach.
Go ahead.
Well, that's just a great point. Do you guys remember last summer when there were issues with the Falcon 9 and basically all launch ground to a complete halt?
Yeah.
We do not want to be facing that situation again in the future or in certain other sectors.
Yeah, and just a riff on the launch, and speaking about what comes after space station and launch, I have talked with some of the CLDs in terms of business cases of that. There probably still is a requirement after station's gone that the government subsidizes launch to orbit. There will still be folks who want to fund that privately in that. It's just so damn expensive to close a business case of getting up onto orbit. And then actually, if you need to come home, come home. So there's probably going to be a continued government need in the LEO environment where we're doing manufacturing, research on pharmaceuticals and those type of things, where there's going to have to be a government investment in ensuring access to space, because it is so incredible. SpaceX, don't get me wrong, SpaceX has brought the cost down significantly, and Starship may actually bring it down even more at some point when it's fully successful and operational, but it's still so damn expensive to get out there from a business case standpoint. So government still needs to be involved in that.
Right. I would probably add to that spaceports. That, you know, we've seen that be a bottleneck, and that is entirely government run, pretty much worldwide. Spaceports being government infrastructure. I know someone here was talking earlier about trying to raise private money for a spaceport in Peru. That would be a tough sell here in the U.S. Even, but that is critical infrastructure that when the Eastern Range has an issue, everyone gets delayed by a week, and that, you know, knocks off like 3 SpaceX launches alone in that. Love to talk more. We're in overtime here on the timer here, so please give the panel a round of applause, and hopefully we've enlightened you a little bit on space policy and kept you awake.